He was calm, composed, and carried nothing but a book and a boarding pass. But to one woman at the gate, his skin and silence were enough to call security. Minutes later, a world-renowned UN legal advisor was in handcuffs, humiliated before takeoff. What the officers didn't know? He'd spent his life designing the laws they just broke. And now, they'd be judged by the man they tried to silence. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It started with a delay. A 7:15 a.m. flight from London Heathrow to New York City had been pushed back by 45 minutes due to fog over the Atlantic. Nothing unusual. The departure hall at Terminal 5 remained calm, filled with the low hum of boarding calls and the clink of coffee cups. Among the sea of passengers, one man stood out, not because he made a scene, but because he didn't. Professor Aidan Baptiste, 64, stood in the business class queue, shoulders relaxed, reading a paperback with quiet intent. He was tall, sharply dressed in a navy wool trench coat and gray trousers, his salt and pepper beard trimmed, his demeanor distinguished, but modest. Aidan was used to airports, used to travel. He'd given over 200 lectures across 4 continents, most recently advising on counterterrorism ethics and international law at The Hague. But that morning, he was simply a passenger. Calm, collected, anonymous, or so he believed. He held a slim leather carry-on and a black laptop bag slung across one shoulder. A crisp boarding pass peeked out from the inside pocket of his coat. His phone remained in his hand, untouched. He wasn't scrolling. He was rereading something. A court transcript from a war crime tribunal in Kyiv. He had underlined phrases in blue ink. His mind was elsewhere. But Heathrow, as it turned out, had other plans for him. At the opposite end of the terminal lounge, seated beside the large glass windows, Veronica Hall watched. Mid-50s, blonde, diamond studs. The kind of woman who knew every wine on the first-class menu and wasn't afraid to correct a flight attendant. Her husband, George, scrolled absently through his phone beside her. Veronica didn't look away from Aidan. Something about him, the stillness, the way he wasn't performing like the rest of the busy travelers, bothered her. She leaned in toward the gate attendant with practiced authority and whispered, "That man, the one in the long coat, something's wrong. He's been watching everyone. Too quiet, too calculated." The agent looked up, confused. "He's just in the business queue, ma'am. Cleared security like everyone else." "I travel enough to know what I feel," Veronica said. "Just report it, please, before it's too late." That was all it took. 2 officers stationed near Gate B16 received the radio call at 7:36 a.m. Suspicious passenger. Male. Mid-60s. Possibly casing the area. No visible threat. Yet. The words landed like gospel. Deputy Officer Luke Raleigh cracked his knuckles as he rose. Young. Confident. The kind of man who believed his badge made his instincts infallible. His partner, Officer Neil Watson, older and more withdrawn, followed quietly behind. They never asked for more details. They never reviewed the footage. They didn't know who he was. They didn't want to. Aiden had just stepped forward in line, passport and ID already in hand, when he noticed the shift behind him. 2 officers, one on either side. His grip on the passport didn't tighten. His eyes didn't flicker. He simply turned and faced them, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Sir," Raleigh said. His voice clipped. "We need to speak with you." Aiden tilted his head slightly. "About?" "We've received a complaint," Watson added. "You're making other passengers uncomfortable." Aiden blinked once. "By standing here?" "We need to see your bag," Raleigh cut in. "Step out of line." Passengers nearby began to turn. Some subtly shifted their phones into recording position. One mother pulled her toddler closer, unsure of who the threat was supposed to be. Aiden slowly stepped aside. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. His mind was already cataloging every detail. "My name is Professor Aiden Baptiste," he said calmly. "I'm a legal advisor to the UN Human Rights Council, and I've cleared every international checkpoint required. What exactly do you suspect me of?" "That's what we're here to find out," Raleigh replied, not answering the question. "Let's go." "Am I under arrest?" "No, sir, but your cooperation is required." "Then I'd like your badge numbers before we proceed." That was the moment. The shift. The quiet act of knowing one's rights spoken aloud in a public space. And it made Raleigh bristle. Power didn't like being questioned, especially by someone it thought it could control. "We're not going to do this here," Raleigh said, stepping into Aiden's personal space. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Aiden didn't move. There's only one lawful way. And just like that, the snap of cold metal echoed across the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the waiting area. Veronica sat back, satisfied. George, still scrolling, didn't look up. The gate agent's hand hovered over the desk phone, unsure if she should call someone, anyone. But it was too late. Aiden Baptiste, world-renowned legal scholar, was now in handcuffs. Not because of what he did, but because of how he looked. Because someone said, "He doesn't belong." Raleigh gripped his arm harder than necessary as he walked him through the terminal. Watson followed silently, jaw tight, eyes darting toward the growing crowd of onlookers. The man they had just detained hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resisted, hadn't even flinched. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't even thought to ask, was who he really was. And before the hour was over, they'd regret it more than they could imagine. The hallway to the airport security office felt colder than the rest of Heathrow. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of what it now represented. A corridor where dignity was stripped and silence was mistaken for guilt. Officer Luke Raleigh's grip on Aiden Baptiste's arm never loosened, not even slightly. There was no struggle. There never had been. But the cuffs stayed on. Aiden didn't speak as they passed the quiet glances of bystanders pretending not to stare. He didn't ask why this was happening, because he already knew. And yet, knowing didn't soften the weight of the moment. It sharpened it. In a small gray room, lined with metal chairs and a humming fluorescent light, Raleigh pushed the door open with his shoulder. "Sit," he ordered. Aiden sat, slow, deliberate. The cuffs bit into his wrists as he adjusted in the chair. Officer Neil Watson stood near the corner, arms crossed, face tight with something between doubt and discomfort. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It pulsed, not with fear, but with truth. Unspoken, thick. "State your name," Raleigh barked, pulling a clipboard from the wall. "You have my identification," Aiden replied, voice even, clipped only by the restraint in his tone. "I asked for your name." Aiden Baptiste, professor, legal consultant to multiple human rights tribunals, most recently retained by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Raleigh didn't look up. He scribbled something onto the page, muttered, "possible alias," under his breath. But Watson's eyes flicked up at that and stayed there. Something shifted in his face. Recognition, perhaps. Or the realization that they hadn't done the most basic thing. Asked. "What exactly am I being detained for?" Aiden continued, the calmness in his tone a quiet rebuke. "We received a complaint. Suspicious behavior. You were seen watching people's bags," Raleigh said, reaching for a tablet. "We'll be reviewing footage shortly. Were you aware I had already cleared passport control and TSA with no flags?" "Doesn't matter," Raleigh said, waving him off. "That was before we received a report?" "A report based on whose assessment of suspicion?" "You're getting defensive, sir," Raleigh said, looking up now with narrowed eyes. "Makes you look guilty." "Guilty of what?" Aiden asked softly. "Of reading in silence?" Watson shifted again. His arms no longer crossed. His hands moved toward his vest, not for his weapon, but in a quiet, nervous fidget. Aiden saw it, noted it. In a courtroom, that would have been the first crack. In this room, it was proof of something festering under the surface. Uncertainty. Raleigh leaned in. "You want to keep playing semantics, Professor? Be my guest. But in this room, I ask the questions." "That," Aiden said, lifting his gaze with purpose, "is exactly the problem." It landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like the opening argument in a case that no one else had realized was on trial. Yet. Outside the room, the airport was stirring. The footage of Aiden's arrest, captured by a teenage passenger and shared with a caption that simply read, "Is this what security looks like now?" had already gained traction. In just 20 minutes, the video had over 15,000 views. The comment section was a battlefield of perspectives, but the footage spoke for itself. An older black man in a long coat, handcuffed, silent, calm, surrounded, humiliated. In the security room, the silence stretched again. Watson finally cleared his throat. "Maybe we should review his documents again." Raleigh didn't respond. Watson took a step forward, pulled Aiden's ID from the evidence tray, and scanned it into the terminal. The screen blinked, then returned a result almost instantly. UK residency, UN identification tag number, international legal credentials, confirmed. "Sir," Watson said hesitantly, "this ID is real, and he's who he says he is." Raleigh snatched the ID back. "We'll verify that through official channels. We're not done here." "No," Aiden said, lifting his cuffed wrists slowly and placing them on the table. "You're done here." The voice that spoke wasn't angry. It was rooted, immovable. The kind of voice that had cross-examined warlords and testified before parliaments. Raleigh stared, suddenly unsure of how much power he still held. A knock came at the door. It wasn't a uniformed officer. It was a man in a black overcoat, holding a silver ID badge against the glass. Watson opened the door. "Can I help you?" The man didn't hesitate. "Agent Declan Rhodes, International Legal Oversight Division. You're detaining a United Nations-affiliated legal officer without jurisdiction or grounds. That ends now." Raleigh stepped forward. "We're conducting an internal investigation." "You're conducting an unlawful detainment," Rhodes interrupted. "We've been contacted by the U.S. Consulate Interpol and the Hague's Emergency Oversight Desk. You're holding a man who trains judges on the Geneva Conventions. The room dropped to freezing silence. Rhodes turned toward Aiden. We've confirmed your identity and are prepared to escort you under international protocol. Do you require medical evaluation? I do not, Aiden said, but I do require documentation. Full report, badge numbers. And these? He lifted his wrists again. To be removed immediately. Watson stepped forward first. His hands trembled slightly as he removed the cuffs. I apologize, sir. Aiden looked him in the eye. You didn't ask. But now that you know, what you do next matters more. Raleigh didn't move. Rhodes turned to him. You'll be contacted by Internal Affairs, and I suggest you retain counsel. No one else spoke. As Aiden stood, he didn't straighten his coat with indignation. He didn't look back in anger. He walked out with the same quiet authority he had walked in with. Only now, the entire world was watching. And that silence he carried? It wasn't compliance. It was preparation. The security checkpoint had returned to its usual rhythm. Flashing scanners, idle chatter, and the sound of luggage wheels slipping over polished linoleum. To the untrained eye, Heathrow had already moved on. But just beyond Gate 19, something had shifted. Something had cracked. Inside the operations room, Agent Declan Rhodes stood with a straight spine and a steel gaze. On the desk before him sat a single, unopened file. Behind him, 3 officers remained frozen. 2 in uniform, 1 in a suit. Their expressions were a mix of confusion and dread. But none looked more unmoored than Officer Luke Raleigh. He hadn't spoken since removing the cuffs from Aiden Baptiste's wrists. He hadn't needed to. The silence said enough. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It was something more dangerous. It was disbelief that his authority could be questioned, his assumptions dismantled so easily. That disbelief was about to meet its reckoning. Declan opened the file slowly. The sound of the paper separating felt louder than any alarm. Let's walk through what we know, he said, voice calm but sharp. You stopped a passenger with no criminal record, no suspicious items, and a verified ticket, based solely on the word of one woman who expressed concern but provided no specifics. He was watching the bags, Raleigh said, almost involuntarily. Do you mean sitting with his own luggage? Declan asked, his tone unchanging. Raleigh swallowed. We reviewed the footage, Declan continued. All of it. Terminal cams, gate security feeds. There was no circling, no erratic behavior. He didn't even move from his chair for over 30 minutes. The room remained still. Then Declan placed a photo on the table. A press image. Aiden Baptiste, standing in front of the United Nations emblem, flanked by a global panel of judges and diplomats. The caption below read, Lead Legal Counsel to the International Commission on Human Rights. Had you taken 60 seconds to run a full ID check, this is what you would have found, Declan said. Instead, you put cuffs on a man who has written constitutional oversight frameworks in over 10 countries. Watson shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know he was... That's the problem, Declan said, cutting him off. You didn't ask. You assumed. You acted. At that exact moment, the door opened again. A second agent walked in and handed a tablet to Declan. The footage just went viral, sir. Over 500,000 views in the last hour. Major media outlets are already running the story. Declan turned the screen toward Raleigh and Watson. The thumbnail showed Aiden standing in his gray coat, flanked by security officers. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't yelling. He was just waiting. The headline read, human rights expert, wrongfully detained at Heathrow, captured on video. Outside the operations room, passengers who had recorded the arrest were now uploading clearer angles. Witnesses were tagging journalists. Aiden's name had started trending, but not just as a victim, as a warning. A line of accountability was drawing itself across the floor of that terminal, and people were paying attention. Back at the gate, Olivia Darnell, the woman who made the initial complaint, remained seated near the window. She'd been watching planes take off for the last hour, her expensive scarf wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting toward the crowd more than the runway. She hadn't expected it to escalate like this, hadn't expected the man to matter. She only wanted him moved, distanced. She didn't care where, until now. Her phone buzzed. A friend had sent her a link. She tapped the screen and froze. There he was, Aiden Baptiste. His full credentials, his affiliations, even a short clip from a TED Talk he had given just a month earlier on racial profiling in European transit hubs. The irony made her stomach turn. Around her, murmurs began to ripple. A teenager pointed in her direction. A woman near the boarding counter whispered to her child. Olivia tried to retreat into the upholstery, but she knew what was coming. The eyes were turning, this time toward her. In the airport lounge above, a journalist had already begun drafting a story titled, "The Cost of a Whisper: How One Woman's Discomfort Sparked a Diplomatic Incident." The words weren't kind, nor were they inaccurate. Downstairs, Declan had turned to Aiden once again, this time in full view of staff and two newly arrived representatives from the airport's legal department. "Mr. Baptiste, do you wish to make a public statement?" Aiden stood slowly, his posture straight, his eyes clear. "Not yet," he said. "There's something more important than what I have to say." "And what's that, sir?" one of the legal reps asked. "That you listen," Aiden replied. "Not just to me, but to the fact that your system allowed this, enabled this. And unless that changes, this won't be the last time." The silence afterward was immediate, but not empty. It was agreement, resigned, acknowledging. And then Declan raised his voice just slightly. "For the record," he said, addressing the officers in the room, "this is Aiden Baptiste, legal advisor to the United Nations, professor of international law, and decorated recipient of the Global Human Rights Medal." Raleigh exhaled like he'd been punched. Watson sat down. Aiden turned and walked toward the exit. This time, no one reached for him. No one blocked his path. The cameras followed, not for spectacle, but for accountability. And as he stepped back into the light of the terminal, everything changed. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a message. And it had been heard. The room was sterile, clinical. Its walls a muted beige that tried and failed to make anyone feel at ease. At the far end of a long conference table sat Aiden Baptiste, his hands no longer bound, but the skin around his wrists still bore the memory of the cuffs. Across from him were 5 federal officials, 2 from the Crown Prosecution Service, 1 from the Metropolitan Police Internal Oversight Board, and 2 legal observers dispatched by the International Civil Liberties Alliance. The air buzzed, not with noise, but with weight. The weight of something that could no longer be buried. Aiden didn't pace. He didn't lean into dramatics. He sat, spine straight, posture poised, eyes sharp. He had spent years building systems of law, untying the knotted threads of government accountability across borders. He had never expected the most personal violation of his rights would happen on British soil, at the edge of a boarding gate, and that he would be forced to recount it as a case study in front of a table of stunned bureaucrats. But this wasn't about personal closure. It was about structural reckoning. He began speaking, not with outrage, but with clinical precision. A play-by-play of what had unfolded, from the false complaint to the unverified suspicion to the exact moment he felt the cold touch of steel on his skin. His voice didn't shake. It never rose. But each word cut through the silence like a scalpel. This wasn't an error, he said. It was a process, flawed by design, defended by habit. One of the observers, a former barrister named Lynette Hayes, leaned forward. You're saying the officers didn't act alone? I'm saying they acted with the full confidence of a system that never required them to ask better questions, Aiden replied. They were taught to fear shadows, not to verify facts. Behind the glass panel in the adjoining room, 2 ethics auditors took notes feverishly. This wasn't just testimony, it was diagnosis. And Aiden wasn't there to point fingers. He was there to draw a map out of the rot. The footage had gone global. His name had become a headline. Politicians weighed in. Editorial boards issued apologies and calls for reform. But while the public raged, Aiden planned. He wasn't going to let this turn into just another viral moment. He would make it a turning point. From the inner pocket of his jacket, he removed a slim, leather-bound folder. Inside were the early pages of a proposal, what he called the Transit Justice Initiative, a framework designed to hold transportation law enforcement accountable to a federal standard of civil liberties review, independent audit panels, transparent escalation reporting, and mandatory anti-bias recertification every 12 months. He handed copies across the table. I wrote this on the flight home, he said. This is not just a response. It's a prototype for prevention. The silence that followed wasn't skeptical. It was stunned. No one had expected the man handcuffed at Gate 19 to return with a legislative solution. No one had imagined the quiet figure in the video, who refused to resist or shout, would become the architect of what would soon be called the most ambitious civil oversight model in Heathrow's history. Meanwhile, in another wing of the building, officers Luke Raleigh and Samuel Watson sat in separate interview rooms. Their uniforms had been replaced by plain clothes, but the weight of their decisions had not lifted. Raleigh stared down at a printed copy of the viral photo. Aiden's face calm, his hands restrained, his dignity intact. And something cracked inside him. He had always prided himself on his instincts, but that pride now sat like stone in his throat. An ethics investigator leaned across the table. Officer Raleigh, when you approached Mr. Baptiste, what did you know about him? Nothing, Raleigh replied, his voice rough. Just what the woman said. She said he looked off. Off, the investigator repeated, circling the word in his notes. And you didn't question that? I didn't think I had to, Raleigh answered. And that's the problem, came the reply. Back in the conference room, Aiden was fielding questions, not about how he felt, but about how to fix what broke. What would you have done differently if you were in charge of that terminal's security infrastructure? One official asked. I would have created checkpoints not for luggage, but for decisions, Aiden answered. Every time an officer acts on a complaint, there should be a documented chain of validation. Was there corroboration? Was the subject approached with respect? Was there escalation before inquiry? He wasn't advocating against caution. He was demanding accountability. The proposal, now spreading across departments, called for public reporting dashboards, encrypted civil rights monitoring logs, and citizen access to review complaint outcomes within 30 days. It was bold, expensive, unapologetically disruptive. And it was exactly what the moment needed. That night, Aidan returned to his hotel room overlooking the Thames. The lights of London shimmered on the surface below, a city moving on like nothing had happened. But inside, Aidan's phone pulsed with life. Dozens of emails, invitations, thank you messages, victims of similar profiling who'd never had a camera recording, law students who'd seen his footage in ethics class, retired judges offering pro bono aid for the initiative. He sat down, opened his laptop, and added the final clause to his proposal. All personnel found to have executed searches or detainment without due cause and verification will be placed on immediate suspension pending review. Then he wrote the line that would later be quoted on the floor of Parliament. We cannot fix what we refuse to document. We cannot restore trust in silence. The storm that had started at a boarding gate had now entered legislation. Not through rage, not through revenge, but through resolve. Because the blueprint of accountability, Aidan knew, wasn't built in courts or on screens. It started here, in quiet rooms, with uncomfortable truths and the courage to demand something better. And he was just getting started. The sky over the courthouse was the color of old ash, the kind that lingers long after the fire is gone, but still smells like something burned. People gathered quietly outside, not in protest, but in reflection. No chants, no placards, just the hum of stories being told. Stories about Aidan Baptiste, the man who had walked through Heathrow Airport weeks earlier, carrying only a coat, a briefcase, and a name that would rattle the pillars of systemic silence. But this was no longer just Aidan's story. The incident had detonated something far beyond the marble floors of that terminal. And now, in his wake, something larger stirred. Not rage, not vengeance, but resolve. Since the day the footage went viral, Aidan had spoken only once to the press. Not at a podium, not under lights, but in a classroom at the University of Cape Town, where he guest lectured before a room full of law students whose eyes burned with the kind of hunger that only injustice can sharpen. He didn't recount the humiliation or the bruises left by the cuffs. He spoke about structure, about erosion, about what happens when systems built to protect instead begin to presume. The question, he had said softly, isn't whether the law can be blind. It's whether those enforcing it ever learn to see at all. That quote would be printed in law journals, etched into protest signs, even tattooed on the arm of one young public defender in Atlanta. But Aidan didn't seek to be remembered as a soundbite. He sought to build something lasting, something louder than the handcuffs, longer than the news cycle. He established the Baptiste Center for Public Truth, a hybrid legal, media, and policy collective aimed at holding institutions accountable through data-backed advocacy and strategic litigation. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise viral moments. It promised impact. Within its first 6 months, the center launched 4 major investigations into racial profiling within international transit hubs, helped overturn 2 unjust deportation rulings, and submitted legislation for mandatory oversight of passenger complaint protocols in 5 countries. But perhaps more quietly, more powerfully, it gave platform to stories like his that never made the headlines. It created a digital archive called The Silenced Files, a curated collection of civilian accounts from people wrongfully profiled, stopped, or detained for nothing more than their name, skin, or silence. The tagline was simple: "We remember loudly." Aiden spent his days differently now. He wasn't testifying in courtrooms, but training the next generation of those who would. He wasn't behind closed doors, negotiating legal language. He was standing before thousands at civic halls, community centers, even churches, translating that language into something people could carry in their pockets like armor. And through it all, he carried the same calm, the same stillness that had once been mistaken for threat now became the center of his strength. The world had seen a black man arrested without cause, but what it remembered was a black man who didn't flinch, who stared down power with grace and never once lowered his voice to be heard. Officer Luke Raleigh was sentenced. So was his partner. The system had moved. Slowly, yes, but publicly. And Olivia Darnell, the woman who set it all in motion with one calculated whisper, faced her own reckoning. Not in jail, but in the unraveling of everything she thought power could protect. Her name became synonymous with a question. What did you see? And what did it cost? The cost, it turned out, was legacy. Because Aiden Baptiste didn't just survive that airport. He rewrote the rules for what happens after. And that's a name no one will dare forget. Aiden Baptiste never walked into that airport expecting to make history. He carried no banners, issued no public challenge, and didn't speak a single word louder than necessary. All he wanted was a quiet flight and the dignity of moving through the world without being reduced to a threat. But the system didn't see Aiden's degrees, his service, or his sacrifice. It saw only his skin, his stillness, and the shadow of its own assumptions. What happened at Heathrow Airport was not an isolated incident. It was a fracture line in a system already riddled with cracks. A whisper became suspicion. Suspicion became escalation. Escalation became handcuffs. And yet, through every unjust step, Aiden never lost control. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He stood in his truth. And in doing so, he forced the truth out of hiding. When the world learned who Aiden really was, a civil liberties strategist, a human rights scholar, a former federal commissioner, it was forced to confront a brutal reality. If this could happen to someone with his level of visibility, access, and protection, what happens every day to those without it? That question became a rallying cry, and that cry became a movement. But Aiden never made it about revenge. He never demanded the spotlight. Instead, he redirected the outrage toward impact. Through the Baptiste Center for Public Truth, he helped elevate stories that would have otherwise disappeared. He didn't just fight for justice. He created a mechanism to ensure others could access it too. From airport policies to public complaint procedures, from digital storytelling to legal training, Aiden turned a personal violation into a blueprint for structural reform. His legacy isn't built on a viral video or a courtroom verdict. It's built on the ripple effect of resilience, the way one act of quiet defiance can spark thousands of louder ones across time zones, borders, and belief systems. So what's the takeaway for all of us watching, reading, or remembering? It's this: dignity isn't something we earn through titles or accomplishments. It's something we possess by birthright, and something we must protect with vigilance. In a world that still judges too quickly and listens too slowly, we each have a role to play. Sometimes it's as simple as recording what feels wrong. Other times, it's asking the uncomfortable question, what if that were me? But the deepest lesson in Aiden's story isn't just about injustice. It's about response, about how we carry ourselves when we're misunderstood, when we're profiled, when we're cornered. Aiden showed us that you don't need to yell to be heard. You need to stand. Stand in your knowledge. Stand in your grace. Stand in the unshakable belief that silence doesn't mean surrender, and calm doesn't mean weak. Let his story be more than just a moment of outrage. Let it be a mirror, a map, and a mandate. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something stir deep inside, don't let that feeling fade. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support the storytellers, but to support the stories. The ones that make us uncomfortable, yes, but also the ones that make us better. Because the fight for justice isn't won in headlines, it's won in hearts. And it starts with us, right here, right now. Let's make sure no story like Aiden Baptiste's ever gets buried again. Subscribe, share, speak, and let the next story be told not just because it's true, but because someone like you made sure it was heard.